Hello and welcome back to another episode of Voiding Vanguard. This is actually going to be more of an honorable mention for this series as the deck itself has gotten plenty of support in both V and Premium in and of itself, but I do want to point out that it is one of those cases where Bushiroad has decided to go a completely different direction than what it was, and this will be Narukami Eradicators. So Eradicators were originally released during the Break Ride era, so from the original BT10 and onward, and they were redone during V, starting from around, I believe it was GBT5 or maybe it was 7, I believe. And the two decks in and of themselves are very different. With Eradicators originally, they focused on either doing retire effects for targeted front row, or they retired as an opponent's choosing. The two break rides of the series that we actually got worldwide are two very good examples, with Vowing Sword retiring something in the front row, and Ignition giving you a your opponent chooses to retire on one counterblast cost. The other example that we never actually got in the US was the Electro Shaper, which on retiring something in the front row, you also retire something in the back row. And that was the way that it did for a good amount of its support, with one of the key cards being Gauntlet Buster, two of the key cards being Gauntlet Buster and Dragonic Descendant. I do not fully include Dragonic Descendant because this one was more of the replacement for Dragonic Overlord that Kai got during the anime. During the anime, after the first arc, the first tournament, they sealed up Kagero Royal Paladin and created Gold Paladin and Narukami. Kai took Narukami and got Dragonic Descent, and then went the Kaiser Vermilion, and then during Link Joker he got the Dragonic Descendant. So this would be both. So that is one of those ones where I consider it to be kind of like a subdivision of Overlord. Whereas Eradicators, who had the retire effects, their main boss monster was Gauntlet Buster Dragon. So as a limit break 4, on retiring one of your opponent's rear guards, it pluses 3 and a crit. So base 11, 1 retire gives it 14k, 2 retires gets it 17k, and so on. But when we got to the end of G and the beginning of V, Narukami went in a very different direction. And not so much different, very different, but it was a slow but gradual change. In G, we got the Dragonic Vanquisher series and the focus on either retiring and binding units or binding units from drop zone. And then Narukami V was complete and utter just bind. The drop zone was very rarely touched for effects. You would either bind something from the front row and then move something from the back, swap positions, or just bind the entire front row. And while I do think that this was a very powerful effect set, I do honestly think that the unbalance comes from the fact that you have two very different Eradicator decks in general. The first one is just retire and focus on the retire effects. And then the second one is the V version where you bind everything. Now, note that these two decks do not mesh at all. You either are choosing to run the Eradicator as the Eradicator deck was original, which means that you would only be using the new cards for just getting Excel markers or naming in the case of Gauntlet Buster, or you're using the bind focus and less focus on the Eradicator name in general. It would just be more like a generalized Narukami deck for V. So I deeply dislike this. I think this was more proof that Bushiroad wanted to get rid of what they had originally, but still keep the players that wanted to play the game like that interested. That's why we got so many Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark Overlord cards in general. We're still getting those cards even in D, where there are no longer any clans, it's just nations, and yet we got Blaster Dark and Dragonic Overlord in set 2, and in set 5 we're looking to get Blaster Blade, Alfred, Majesty Lord Blaster, Dragonic Overlord the End, and Phantom Blaster Overlord. But that's just me harping. So some of the ideas that I created were either cards that just retire based on effects, or deal with the opponent's bind zone. So it's either you're going further with the original effects that they had, or you are working with what the deck, the generalized V version of the deck does, and then taking that and changing it into your own abilities. So I'm going to start with the first stride that I made, the Gauntlet, the Great Eradicator Gauntlet Burst Dragon. So as a GB2 skill, you discard 2 cards from your hand. On attack, you can pay the cost. If you do, you choose 2 of your opponent's rear guards and retire them. Then your front row gains plus 2k for every card in the opponent's bind zone, as well as 1 crit. And then as an auto effect, whenever you retire an opponent's rear guard, you bind 2 cards from their drop zone. So once again, this is kind of becoming more of a bridge for old Eradicator decks to fight on the same level as current Eradicator decks, as you're focusing more on the retire aspect, but you're also constantly building your opponent's bind zone. And then another card that I also wish actually did come back, which was Tempest Bolt Dragon, where as a limit break 4 for 3 a special counterblast of Eradicator, you retired the entire field. So both your rear guards and your opponent's rear guards went completely to the drop zone. And it gained plus, I believe it was 2k power for each open circle. So at base, after using its ability, that would be a bonus, I believe, let's see. I believe it would be a bonus 20,000 power, so base 31 without any alterations. But it would be a case of the True Eradicator Tempest Crash Dragon. A continuous ability would be whenever a card is moved from the opponent's bind zone, bind 1 card from their drop zone. And this is a continuous non-once per turn effect. So anytime you're moving a card from your opponent's bind zone to their drop zone, you immediately bind something else from the drop zone. And then its GB Generation Break 3 skill is a counterblast 2 and turn a face down card from your G zone with Eradicator its name face up. So any Eradicator flip, so you could easily use the Gauntlet Burst. You could use Finish Blow. You could go ahead and even use the Alcotinium Eradicator Linshu. But it's a retire all of your opponent's rear guards and then call the same number of rear guards units that were retired from your opponent's bind zone to those circles. So if you retired a full field of 5 cards, you would choose 5 cards from your opponent's bind zone and then call them to those rear guard circles in your choice. The balance of that, as opposed to letting your opponents choose, is that the opponent has any effects that they would get on place or any effects that they would just gain, they would activate. So if you're facing a Link Joker deck and they have an auto ability that says on call lock something, they are free to activate that if they wish. If they have an ability that buffs their Vanguard, they activate that as they wish. And then after you're done, it gains plus 15k power and an additional 2 critical. So once again, I'm trying to balance it out by saying that, there's ways to get things out of your opponent's bind zone and then get things back into your opponent's bind zone through effects that you have. Again, I might think that when a unit moved from the opponent's bind zone, or maybe whenever you bind a card, it would be more like allowing the opponent to say whenever you an opponent's card is moved from their bind zone to anywhere else, or whenever a rear guard is retired, to make it so that it works well with every single Eradicator in that set. But then I also created a G guard called Shell Eradicator Gold Absorb Spark. And so I made it to work against what Narukami necessarily does, but it also does have its own kind of ability bonus on that, where when it's placed on guard circle, you return all cards in your opponent's bind zone to their drop zone. If you do, it pluses 5k shield for every 3 cards returned. So in a normal game of Narukami, when after your first like maybe stun verse skill, you're normally never going to do that without at least 4 cards in your bind zone. So that's at least 5k shield. It's not as powerful as some other G guards maybe, but its condition is very easy, and Narukami in general does actually have a very good ability to bind things. But I also added something more to it, in that I added 2 alternate conditions for using it as a Thunderstrike 10. So if your opponent has 10 or more cards in their bind zone, and then I also created another keyword called Lightning Zone or Bolt Zone, maybe, is whenever you have that number of cards in your bind zone. So this is also trying to be a pure anti-Narukami card, both anti-yourself and anti your opponent, kind of like what Dungaree has become recently in the latest V effects. So both of them are going to have a cost. For Thunderstrike, it's going to be 10. And then for Lightning Zone, I'm thinking it's going to be maybe around 5 or 6. But you would pay a alternate cost to calling it as a G Guardian instead of discarding that heal card. So for example, the Thunderstrike is going to be a Counterblast a specific Eradicator card. So Counterblast 1 a special, Eradicator a special. And then the Lightning Zone is actually going to be a Soul Blast Eradicator. And this is going to free up possible heals, possible other options, especially in decks that heavily bind. There are plenty of ways to countercharge. There are plenty of ways to soul charge. It's not necessarily one of the lowest costs, but it has very decent maintenance cost abilities. So this is just another way of making something. Also, recently there's a lot of other specific G guards that are very, very good for being specific. I do know that the Musketeer one is a Soul Blast on place for 5, and then if you have either 4 or more units or 1 or less units, so at the various ends of where you are, it gains an additional 15k to shield. So it is possible to have this card become a very large shield. I also thought of some other ones that actively bind your own stuff, because we do have a G-Guard for Narukami that's actually a weird one. It's a Noble G-Guard that binds your own cards, and I believe it's bind unplaced. You can check the top 5 cards of your deck, choose 2 of them, or no, I think it's you choose 2 cards from your drop zone and bind them face up. If you do, it pluses 10k until the end, 10k shield until the end of the battle. So I think that there should be some other ways to bind your own cards. So the grade 2 is on place, you bind 2 cards from your drop zone. If you do, you bind 2 cards from your opponent's drop zone. If this card is placed on Vanguard, you can pay the cost from the top of the deck. So instead of binding from your drop zone, which you might not have anything if you're riding it, you bind the top 2 cards of your own deck, and then bind the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. It's not trying to be overly powerful, which a lot of the recent V cards have been very, very powerful. It's just trying to become a card that just gives you a basic Thunderstrike ability, not necessarily doing anything specifically big. But there's also the one I made, and it's you bind any number of cards from your drop zone. You choose bind any number of cards from your drop zone, choose as a once per turn. Choose one of your opponent's rear guards and bind the number of cards equal to that unit's grade. If you do, you retire and bind it. So once again, I'm going back to the retire ability, the idea that you're retiring for your own effect. And then next up, I did another grade 2. On a rear guard, you bind up to 3 cards from your drop zone. On attack, it pluses 3k per card, so a max of 9k for the attack until the end of the battle. If you bound more than 2 cards, bind an opponent's rear guard with the same grade as the total number. And then if you bound only one card, you bind one from the drop zone. So at the max, you bind 3 of your own cards to get rid of a grade 3 that's possibly annoying. You get rid of 2 cards, which is the most likely. You get rid of an opponent's attacker and interceptor. You also buff yourself, so it's again kind of breaking into that kind of overly broken but still usable. And then I also kind of had an idea for an order card where it's a grade 3 order. It's a once per turn act on Generation Break 3. Whenever you bind a card from your opponent's drop zone, bind another number of cards from their drop zone equal to the grade of that card. So if you're constantly targeting cards in your opponent's drop zone that are grade 3 or 2, you're binding extra cards every single turn. This is also trying to be more focused on the effects of G Narukami as opposed to V Narukami. It's, again, trying to put them on the same kind of level without having to rely necessarily on Stunverse. But that is what I think of Eradicators. On kind of a side note, I've mentioned the Stunverse Dragon multiple times, and I think the way it was released, it is incredibly broken. It's basically a card that punishes a person for actually playing the game. So the effect is simply, I believe it is Soul Blast 1, and turn any card in your G-Zone, face down card in your G-Zone and turn it face up. You immediately remove it and place it into your G-Zone face up. Then then your opponent chooses up to 4 cards from both their rear guards and their drop zone and binds them face up. Then for every 4 cards in your opponent's bind zone, you draw 1 card, and then your opponent binds a card from their hand. I do believe that this is a little bit too much of a broken card, especially since the basic thing that I said is that it punishes people for playing Vanguard. The idea is that either you call enough cards to do what you need to do and try and win before your opponent strides, or you play extremely conservatively, not guard anything, try and get to 5 damage as fast as possible, and then when you're able to try and make a massive move, that is when you do your extremely big items. I do believe that this card could have been nerfed a little bit on release, as we have seen cards that have been overpowered from release and then banned. The specific example that I can actually think of is the second stride of Ichikishima. So its basic effect was that you disallowed any auto abilities for Guardian Circles, so no sentinels could go off. Most of the G guards were shut off. And that one got banned very quickly because people realized that you could have essentially a turn free of guarding. If you ran stands, it became even more dangerous. So it comboed very well with the original Silent Tom. So no auto abilities and then no grade 0s on their attacks. But now with the 30k shield Sentinel criticals, it is possible to use it as a just a one-of. But getting back to Stunverse, I personally believe that its effect should have either been keep it as a rest effect, so Soul Blast 1, rest this unit, and then flip the card over. So not only are you no longer having an attack with a Vanguard, you're it's balancing out its skill a little bit better, allowing your opponent to say, I lost a lot of cards, but at least I'm avoiding a Vanguard's attack for this turn. The other option is to make it something like Conquest Full Bronto, where the number of cards that you can retire is based on the number of face-up cards in your G-Zone, not including itself, because it would go back and then automatically count itself as a second card. So the way that I would reword it is I would do it as one card per face-up card in your G zone. So this would be a case where it would be overkill beyond 5, but it would still be usable because you could get rid of your opponent's drop zone. But if you use it right away, it wouldn't do as much damage. I know that a lot of people are going to say that Stunverse is very, very necessary. I asked this question. How is Stunverse anything different from Bruce's Leonard and Derek? But anyways, thanks for listening. This is a little bit longer than I usually do, but who knows? Maybe I'll do more of this one. Thanks and have a nice day.